Hey girls, Miss Bauer here. I just kind of wanted to talk about the acute responses to exercise and energy systems and try and link them together on this graph so that you have a better understanding of what's going on. I know this graph is very busy, but let's start at the start, which is here. So before we even start exercising, our body is obviously in a resting state. The energy system that is dominant during rest is our aerobic system because there's not a great demand for oxygen, so our oxygen supply and demand are equal. So at rest, the body shows a clear preference for fats as a food fuel over carbohydrates. So at rest, 2/3 of the food fuel is contributed by fats and the other third by carbohydrates. At the start of exercise, our oxygen consumption starts to increase here. However, there's a temporary shortage of oxygen in the cells which occurs at the start of exercise when the body's demand for oxygen is exceeding its supply. So if you have a look at the graph, if we were to draw a line up here, this is how much oxygen the body actually needs, but this is how much that we're actually providing. So we see a thing called oxygen deficit. And it's because the respiratory and cardiovascular systems can't act quick enough to satisfy the demand for oxygen, and therefore ATP resynthesis must be obtained from anaerobic energy systems which don't rely on oxygen. When the athlete starts to exercise, for the first 10 seconds, the predominant energy system is going to be the phosphate creatine system. The advantage of this system is that it's very fast or very quick. It has a high rate in terms of resynthesizing ATP. However, the disadvantage is that it's limited by the amount of phosphate creatine that can be stored in the muscles. From the 10-second mark to the 60-second mark in the race, the athlete is now relying very heavily on their anaerobic glycolysis system to resynthesize ATP. There's still oxygen deficit that's occurring, and the fuel that is used is glycogen. An advantage of the anaerobic glycolysis system is that it's fast, not as fast in terms when comparing it to the ATP-PC system. However, it has a greater capacity compared to the ATP-PC system in producing more ATP molecules. A disadvantage of having the anaerobic glycolysis system as the predominant energy system in this part of the race are the associated byproducts of this system, such as your lactic acid, the increase in hydrogen ions, and the ADP. So you can see that oxygen consumption rises rapidly here at the start of exercise for the first few minutes until sufficient oxygen is taken up, transported, and utilized to meet exercise demands. Here, when we see a plateau on the graph, this is known as steady state, in which oxygen supply equals oxygen demand, and virtually all of the ATP required is being supplied aerobically. So when the body is in steady state, lactate can be broken down, removed, and converted back into glycogen, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. When the athlete is working aerobically, for the first 90 minutes to 2 hours, the athlete is using glycogen as a fuel source, and then after the first 90 minutes to 120 minutes, so about the 2-hour mark, the athlete will transition from using glycogen to fats as a food fuel. The problem with this is that there's a greater oxygen cost associated with breaking down triglycerides. Now, what we see here in the graph is during the race, the athlete may increase their intensity by increasing their pace. So we see oxygen deficit occur again before the athlete reaches a steady state. In this part of the race where the athlete increases their intensity by speeding up, the predominant energy system is still the aerobic energy system. So it's really important to note that the athlete here is still predominantly using their aerobic system. However, there is a greater contribution made by the anaerobic glycolysis energy system. When the athlete has increased their intensity, this is known as working above their VO2 max. Okay, so the athlete then hits a steady state for the second time where they're working the predominant energy system is the aerobic energy system, and then you can see here that exercise finishes. You can see that oxygen consumption doesn't just drop back straight down to resting values, it slowly declines, and this is known as EPOC. Now, EPOC is also known as excess post-oxygen consumption, and it's the volume of oxygen being used during recovery from exercise in excess of resting oxygen consumption. It's also referred to as oxygen debt, and at the completion of exercise, the demand for ATP here obviously declines. However, the amount of oxygen required still remains above resting levels to assist in the removal of metabolic byproducts. Now, there's two parts to EPOC. The first one is the fast replenishment that occurs, and that just is involved in ATP resynthesis, phosphate creatine resynthesis, and also restoring oxygen to myoglobin in the cells. The slow replenishment of EPOC is involved in returning core temperature to pre-exercise levels and converting lactic acid to carbon dioxide, water, glycogen, protein, or glucose. And it's also involved in restoring heart rate, ventilation, and other body systems to pre-exercise levels. We will talk about EPOC when we talk about recovery in a little bit more detail, so don't stress too much about that. Now, I did forget to mention the acute responses that go on during oxygen deficit. So we did talk about the fact that oxygen deficit here, ATP is supplied predominantly by the anaerobic systems, so your ATP-PC system and your anaerobic glycolysis system. Oxygen consumption increases because there's an increase in ventilation, which is increased by increasing your respiratory rate and your tidal volume, and we also see an increase in gaseous exchange at the alveoli site and at the muscle site. In terms of the cardiovascular acute responses, we see an increase in heart rate, stroke volume, and therefore an increase in cardiac output. This increase in cardiac output causes an increase in blood pressure, mainly systolic blood pressure. Another acute response to the cardiovascular system when oxygen deficit is occurring is that there's an increase in blood flow to the working muscles and a decrease in blood flow to the vital organs, and this is achieved through vasoconstriction and vasodilation. When we're talking about the acute responses of the muscular system, we see a decrease in energy substrates and an increase in temperature. We also see an increase in motor unit recruitment, an increase in blood flow, as I said, to the working muscles, and there's also an increase in AVO2 difference because our muscles are requiring more oxygen and using more oxygen to create ATP.